Good morning. Good to see everyone this morning. Last week in this class, we dealt with the Transfiguration. I have a sermon that I've written. I don't think I've ever done it here. I've only done it one time anywhere. But it's titled, The Day Moses Entered the Promised Land. And because he was there on the Mount of Transfiguration, he was present. He and Elijah talked with Jesus. As you noted last week in class, they talked about his departure, which was impending. He's about to die and then ascend into heaven. Now, it's right after that we pick up this story for today, and we're going to begin by looking at Mark chapter 9. There's going to actually be some cross-referencing between Mark and Matthew, at least in this early going. So Mark chapter 9, verse 14. And when he came to the disciples, he saw a great multitude around them, and the scribes disputing with them. Not every writer tells us that the scribes are part of this. But this writer does, Mark does. And Mark would have known because, at least as we understand it, think it, historically speaking, Mark probably got all of his information from Peter and wrote this gospel. Some think that he wrote it based on sermons that Peter preached. That may be true, may not be true. That's a good guess on our part. But notice McGarvey says these scribes had caught the apostles in one and perhaps the only case where they had failed to cure. And they were making full use of the advantageous opportunity to discredit Christ and his apostles before the people by asking sneering and sarcastic questions. And you can just about imagine how that would have gone. They're their enemies. They're the enemies of Jesus. They want to bring down the work of Jesus because he's taking the people away from them. At least that's their view of it. And so that's what they're involved in. Verse 15, immediately when they saw him, that is Jesus, all the people were greatly amazed and running to him, greeted him. Now, why were they amazed? It appears that they were amazed because Jesus came at just the right time. Right when it's almost like he catches the scribes with their hand in the cookie jar, so to speak. They're laying into the apostles, but they're not. Are they ready to deal with the master? And the answer is no, they're not. He's going to deal with them, and that's what seems to happen here. Pick up verse 16. And he asked the scribes, "What are you discussing with them?" Then one of the crowd answered and said, "Teacher, I brought you my son who has a mute spirit, and wherever it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. So I spoke to your disciples that they should cast it out, but they could not." Now notice, Jesus asked the question of the scribes, but before they can even answer, the Father answers. And I can understand that. If I was going to a doctor that supposedly had the cure for something that I just couldn't be cured of, if I got there and other people were talking about other things and that somehow involved me and my situation, I'd probably interrupt too, wouldn't you? I'd probably step right in and speak up. And that's what this father does. He says, here's the problem. I brought my son, your disciples could not heal him. Now, if you would, look at Matthew 17, because there's where we're running into the parallel of this story. Matthew chapter 17, and we're going to look particularly at verses 14 through 16, because we're really looking at the same story. And when they had come to the multitude, a man came to him, kneeling down to him and saying, "Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is an epileptic and suffers severely. For he often falls into the fire and often into the water. So I brought him to your disciples, but they could not cure him." So notice now we're learning something about the nature, a little bit more about the nature of the illness of the boy. He's a deaf, mute, epileptic. Those are the things that are going on with him. Verse 21 of Mark now. We're going to jump back and forth, so you might ought to keep a finger there. So he asked his father, how long has this been happening to him? And he said, from childhood. Now, I want everybody to remember that. This is not an overnight, one-time problem. This is since he was a child. This is how long this has been going on. Probably a lot of people in the area knew that. You would expect that, because they probably would have seen him, maybe fall down in that epileptic type episode that was brought on by the Spirit. That's at least a possibility. So verses 22 and 23 there in Mark. And often he's thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. Now, I want to pause just a second. I'll read the next verse. But notice the word if. If. And it's almost like Jesus is going to respond to that if suggestion. In other words, can he? Well, of course he can. No doubt about it. So we go on in the next verse. Jesus said to him, if you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. Some of the best people at causing someone to see an issue are notorious, and in a good way, for taking what the other person says and using that to build the next sentence. The Father said, if you can, and Jesus comes back, well, if you can believe. See, the real issue is not whether I can or not, the Lord's saying. The issue is, can you believe? Can you believe this is going to happen? And so that's what's going on as we come on through this. Look at verse 24. Immediately the father of the child cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. And I just wonder how many of us might similarly answer in certain circumstances. I believe, but I'm not as strong as I'd like to be. Faith is really an ever-growing process. If we're going to be what we ought to be, we're going to have to keep growing on and on and on. And this father says, well, I've got belief, but it's not very strong. And maybe sometimes I just need to admit that to God in my prayers. Just say, Lord, I know you can do this. I know you can take care of this situation, but I just don't always have enough strength to put full trust in you. And that's basically what this father is saying at this particular point. Now, if you would turn to Luke, because Luke deals with all this in Luke chapter 9. And we want to pick up on some things. Remember, he's the doctor. Jesus is a great physician, but Luke is the doctor. And sometimes he'll make some observations that are helpful in a series like this. So pick up at verse 41 of Luke chapter 9. Then Jesus answered and said, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here. Now, that faithless part is not directed toward the dad. If you read this context, that's directed toward the disciples. They couldn't do it. And so their faith is weak too. And he notes that. But he gets the dad to bring the son, and as he was still coming, the demon threw him down and convulsed him, and Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, healed the child, and gave him back to his father. And they were all amazed at the majesty of God. The crowd was astonished at God's ability. And isn't it interesting that Luke says they were amazed at the majesty of God? It doesn't say the majesty of Jesus is God. And that's appropriate because Jesus is able to work these miracles on earth because of God. We've observed that previously in this class when we looked at their accusation, the Pharisees' accusation that he cast out demons by the power of the devil. That's in Matthew chapter 12 and also in Mark chapter 3. When they accused him of that, he said, every blasphemy is going to be forgiven. You can speak against the Father, you can speak against the Son, but when you speak against the Spirit, that won't be forgiven. Either in this age or the age to come, which will be age of Moses, age of Christ. Not going to be forgiven. Why not? Because really, the Holy Spirit is God's last outreach to man, when you think about it. Jesus was going to send him. When he ascended to heaven, the Spirit was going to come. He was going to cause them to be able to write down all the words that Jesus said, plus anything Jesus didn't get to say because the people were not ready for it. Everything in the Bible is from the Spirit inspiring men to speak. So if you reject him, what other source have you got? Where are you going to go? That's why, what this is all about. So Jesus is working the miracles because he is God, but he's also working these miracles because the Holy Spirit empowers him to do that very thing. Now, why were they awed at the majesty of God? Now I want you to go back and remember what we said earlier. This boy had been tormented since childhood. People around would have, as I said, suggested, they would have known. And this would have been just an amazing event. It would have been remarkable in their eyes and even in ours if we're able to be there. Any questions so far? Okay, now we're going to turn totally to the apostles. And we're going to particularly look at the book of, well, first I want to look at Mark. Oh boy, I bet that cannot be the right reference. Well, I'll look at it, but I don't think I'm right. If I'm not right, I'll have to look it up and tell you later. Because that one doesn't strike me just immediately. That's not right. So I apologize. We'll look at Matthew. Matthew chapter 17, verses 19 and 20. Now he's going to turn his attention to the disciples. Why? Well, verse 19 tells us, then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, why could we not cast it out? Now, obviously I've got the wrong reference here, but you remember when they went on the limited commission that they came back and said, why the demons respond to us? We're able to cast them out. And so, they had done it before, but they couldn't do this one. And so they come to Jesus and want to know why. Why were we not able to do it? And his answer is, because of your unbelief. But now, wait a minute. Look in the marginal reading, because the marginal reading says little faith. It's not that they don't have any faith at all. They had faith enough to go out on the limited commission, and they had faith enough to cast out some demons. They just didn't have enough faith to do this. Okay, so that's important. The marginal reading helps us a little bit. Because of your unbelief, for surely I say to you, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you'll say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. And nothing will be impossible. Oh boy, I'm in trouble again. All right, all I'm doing is talking, folks. I guess I can't even be perfectly still. I apologize. I don't know what to do about it, except just tolerate it. I'm doing the best I can. It's driving me nuts, whether it does you or not. Okay, so So, what about this moving mountains? I think that is an example. It not hyperbolic per se, because if there were a need to move a mountain, they could do that. But I don't really think that's the point. I think Jesus is saying, if it's a massive problem, even if it's massive, if you've got the faith as a grain of mustard seed, you can deal with it. And that's a challenge to all of us. There are days when not, I don't have miraculous ability, but there are days when my faith is strong enough to face really difficult situations. And there are other days when I need the help of a brother or a sister to be able to face difficult situations. So Jesus is pointing to that fact just a little bit. The Truth Notes said this, and this whole series is done by the Truth for Today commentaries people. They had some faith because they assumed they could cast the demon out, but their faith still lacked. A mustard seed is small but real, alive. It has great potential. A mustard seed is small and weak, but it willingly accepts the strength of the soil that surrounds it. The size of faith is not as important as the focus of our faith. Mountains here represent obstacles. There's nothing you cannot overcome with the right faith. So now go back to Mark chapter 9, verse 29, because McGarvey used that to make an observation that I think is helpful to all of us. Mark 9, 29. So he said to them, this kind can come out by nothing but prayer and fasting. Sometimes the only thing that will help my faith or your faith is prayer. We need to just turn it over to God. That's been one of the hardest lessons, and I'm not going to say I have learned it. It's a hard lesson to learn, is that when you got real problems in life, you've got to hand it over to God. And I'm trying to learn. I've learned to say, just to openly say to God in my prayers, I don't understand this. I don't know how to deal with this. I need your help. And I think that's actually the beginning way to go to greater strength and faith. I don't know what your experience is, but when I'm doing something that's new to me, one of the best lessons I need to learn, and have tried to learn at least, is it never hurts to stop and ask the person that knows. If I was out working with concrete and didn't know what to do, I'd call Kip. Say, Kip, what do I do now? Why? Well, he's been working with it for a day or two. He knows something about it. And it works that way with faith too. You've got to realize that God knows. And that if we really, really got faith, that we'll reach out to Him, and then our faith can grow. Now, Luke chapter 9, verse 44 has an interesting little comment that goes along with this, that comes in the next part, because they've just learned that they need to have greater faith, and now he goes ahead. 43 was they were amazed with the majesty of God, and then, but while everyone marveled at all the things which Jesus did, he said to his disciples, let these words sink down into your ears, for the Son of Man is about to be betrayed into the hands of men. Sink down. Man, I don't know if I can make this change or not. Gone. Okay, sorry. We're going to try again. If they don't get that thing in there just right, it's too loose, and any movement on my part is bad news. And I tend to move. If you hadn't figured that out yet, I tend to. Okay, so let's back up a little bit. So in verse 44 of Luke chapter 9, notice he said, "Let these words sink down. Take them into your heart." Why say that? Partly because they're really not going to grasp this right now. Number one, I'm not sure they understand what he's saying. Number two, they don't want to. We've talked about that before when we're talking about, when they tell you you've got a terminal illness. The first time you hear that, you don't want to hear it. Maybe you all are not like me, but that's my response to that kind of thing. I've been with brethren when they learn these kinds of things. The first response is, "Nah, that's happened to other folk, won't happen to me." But here he's telling them something they're not ready to receive yet. And so he says, put this in your memory bank and it'll come back. You will remember later, what's important about this. So now, go back to Matthew, and I know we're bouncing around, but I'm trying to pick up the key pieces of information from each place. Matthew 17, 22 and 23. "Now, while they were staying in Galilee, Jesus said to them, 'The Son of Man is about to be betrayed into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and the third day he'll be raised up.' And they were exceedingly sorrowful." This is not the first time they've heard this. After the confession in Matthew chapter 16, he told them the same thing. But again, I promise you, it doesn't matter how many times you get told bad news, you don't want to believe it. Yes, sir. Okay. Chris said, notice this time Peter keeps his mouth shut. If you go back to the Matthew incident, Matthew 16, he said, "Lord, don't talk like that." And the Lord said, "Get behind me, Satan." So this time, Peter doesn't say anything. This time, that is a good observation that he didn't speak up this time. Now look at Mark 9:45. All this is what each one is telling us about these incidents. "And if your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. It's better for you to enter life lame rather than having 2 feet to be cast into hell, into the fire that shall never be quenched, where their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. And if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye rather than having 2 eyes to be cast into hell fire, where their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched." Now, I want us to notice what's going on here that he is referring to. And that is that there are things that are precious to us, that are valuable to us. But if they're going to stand between us and going to heaven, then we need to get rid of them. Now, he uses things that we won't be in trouble to grab hold of. If your right eye offends you, I don't particularly want to lose my right eye. I don't want to lose either one of my eyes, but especially not my right, because all the doctors say that my right eye is the dominant in my particular layout of my brain or whatever, and I don't want to lose that. I don't want to give that up. But would it be better to lose the eye, or which would you rather have? Lose the eye or go to hell? That's pretty easy, And same way we can talk about your hand or your foot or whatever. These are valuable to us, but they're not more valuable than eternity with God. And that's all he's really doing. He's illustrating these. These are hyperbolic illustrations. Dramatic, meant to cause us to think about these matters, and that's why that it comes up like that. Okay, now go again back to Mark chapter 9. We're at verse 45. And here's what happens. I just did that one. They were puzzled over it, and that's a good point. So let's go ahead. Matthew 17. Matthew 17, we're going to pick up verse 24. When they come to Capernaum, those who received the temple tax came to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the temple tax?" Okay, now, first of all, these notes are directly copied from the truth notes, and I know better than to copy without checking, but I didn't. But I did it anyway. So it says, you'll notice, it says Exodus 20. That is wrong. Exodus 20 is the giving of the law, the Ten Commandments. So change it to Exodus 30. If you get Exodus 30, you'll be right. They just missed, a little bit on that. So temple tax, what's he talking about? Well, go back to Exodus 30 briefly, and it'll describe it for us, beginning of verse 11, just like they say. They got the verses right. They just got the chapter wrong. And here's what it says. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "When you take the census of the children of Israel for their number, then every man shall give a ransom for himself to the Lord when you number them, that there may be no plague among them when you number them. This is what everyone among those who are numbered shall give: a half a shekel, according to the shekel of the sanctuary. A shekel is 20 gerahs. The half shekel should be an offering to the Lord. Everyone included among those who are numbered from 20 years old and above shall give an offering to the Lord. The rich shall not give more, the poor shall not give less than half a shekel when you give an offering to the Lord to make atonement for yourselves. And you shall take the atonement money of the children of Israel and shall appoint it for the service of the tabernacle of meeting, that it may be a memorial for the children of Israel before the Lord to make atonement for yourselves." So what is the temple tax as they describe it? Well, it is used to take care of the tabernacle. And you know as well as I do that any building, or in this case tent, is going to require maintenance. Of course, it's got the Levites serving there. They're part of the maintenance that goes on, and there's going to need to be some money to be able to take care of these things. So that's what they're asking about. Now, what is this half shekel? I don't recall going into Walmart and it's saying that something was only a half a shekel. That's not familiar with me. Maybe it is with you, but not me. So what is it? Now look at these notes. A shekel was roughly equivalent to 4 denarii or 4 drachmas. A drachma was a Greek coin which was close to a Roman denarius. Both a drachma and a denarius were close to a day's wage for a common laborer. So a half a shekel was worth 2 denarii or drachma. Well, if it's worth 2 denarii, how much is it? 2 days' work. Now, I don't know today what that would be. I marvel now. I don't know about you. How many places I go in and they've got a sign up, we're going to pay this much an hour, just get somebody in here. We got to get some warm bodies. Now I've seen it all the way up to $16 an hour. Right, that they're willing to pay just to get somebody to come to work. Well, what is 16 times 8? That'd be 60 and 48, $108. So temple tax in that case, if you're making $16 an hour, and that's a day's wage, then we'll say 2 times that, 2 days' wages, what the tax was. It's 2 full days' wages. It's a hefty tax in one sense, but how many Levites are going to rely upon this gift? Well, a good many, as they take care of the temple, or the tabernacle in the early days, the temple in the later days. Everybody with me so far? So that's the tax. Now, Peter just answers. And he says, well, yes, he pays it. Well, Jesus is going to make a point here. It's quite interesting, really, what the point is that he's going to make. So go ahead here. Peter says, verse 25, yes. And when he had come into the house, Jesus anticipated him, saying, what do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take customs or taxes? From their sons or from strangers? And Peter said to him, from strangers. Jesus said to him, then the sons are free. In other words, I'm the son of God. I don't need to pay the temple tax. It's God's house. I'm a son. Don't need to pay the tax. That's what he's saying. But now watch the next statement. Very interesting. Nevertheless, lest we offend them, go to the sea, cast in a hook, and take the fish that comes up first. And when you've opened its mouth, you'll find a piece of money. Take that and give it to them for me and you. Now, if it's for both, then that piece of money must have been worth 4 days' wages. Must have been. But what's significant here? I think what we need to learn is that sometimes, even though we don't have to do something, we do it for the sake of the other person. Now, you can't do something sinful. That's not what we're talking about. But you can do something for their sake that you might not be ready to do. I'll give you a prime example. Brother Lowry, we called him Shorty. That was the only nickname I ever heard. Brother Lowry, back in Mobile, Alabama, would not come to a fellowship meal on Sunday. Now, why not? Because I asked him one day, I said, Brother Lowry did everything around the building. He was constantly involved. He loved the work of the church. I said, Brother Lowry, why don't you come? He said, in a private place, a quiet place, he said, Gary, he said, we've got a few members that think it's wrong to do that. And he said, I forgo it, not because I think it's wrong, but because I don't want to hurt them. Well, that's an example of what we're talking about. I don't know if you can think of another one. It might come up someday. It's for the sake of the brethren, for the sake of someone's soul, it's better to give up what you might be allowed to have if it's not sinful to give it up. See, I can't give up the Lord's Supper. If somebody's offended by that, I'm not going to give that up because I have instructions regarding the Lord's Supper. But something that is, I'll say, optional, then that I ought to be ready to give up. Paul does the same thing when you think about it. You talk about his writings in, for example, 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and in Romans chapter 14. What does he say? He says, well, if it's going to cause my brother to be offended and go into hell, he said, I'll give up meat for the rest of my life. Okay, well, did he have the right to eat meat? Yes, he did have the right to eat meat. In fact, Peter learned that don't call anything God made common or unclean. That's in Acts chapter 10. But he was willing to give up meat if it would help his brother go to heaven. That's a good example. So that's what Jesus is doing here. He doesn't owe the tax because he's a son, but he gives it anyway because of it. Now, by the way, he pays it by a miracle. Don't want to miss that, by just, breezing through here. He tells Peter, go catch the first fish you catch. It's going to have some money in its mouth. Take that and go and pay the tax. All right, chapter 18 of Matthew, verse 1. This is probably one of the most familiar of the discussions that we're going to run into. Listen to what happens. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus saying, who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? I would have you to note that 3 times in 5 verses here, the word kingdom's used. It's used in 18:1, 18:3, and 18:4. Kingdom, kingdom, kingdom. The church in the book of Matthew is the kingdom of heaven. Over and over and over again. Why highlight that? Because the Jews to whom Matthew wrote, The Jews were looking for a king. The Jews were looking for a new kingdom, a restored kingdom is the way they viewed it, the kingdom of David. But because they're looking for that, Matthew highlights the word kingdom all the way through his writings. I think that's very important. You got kingdom mentioned when John goes out to preach in Matthew chapter 3. Kingdom's mentioned when Jesus goes out to preach, Matthew chapter 4. It is a constant in the book of Matthew, kingdom, because Jesus came to be a king. But now they're wanting to know who is the greatest. Now, when you think about it, if you look at Mark's idea, Mark tells about something that went on, and it may be the identical time. Some authors think it was. Mark chapter 9, we particularly want to look at verses 33 and 34. And then he came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What was it you disputed among yourselves on the road?" But they kept silent, for on the road they had disputed among themselves who would be the greatest. And that sounds like a pretty typical discussion. You want to watch this same kind of discussion go on. Watch two little boys, get with one another, and every now and then one of them will say, "My daddy's better than your daddy." And here it goes. Well, we have a tendency to want to be the greatest. That's what they wanted, but unfortunately, this discussion reflects an attitude of the heart, doesn't it? Instead of wanting to be like the Lord, and by the way, this is going to be in the sermon today, so I'm not going to go into great depth on it yet. But instead of wanting to be like the Lord and wanting to assume a lowly position, they want the high spot. They want to be on top. And they're embarrassed, apparently, when Jesus asked them, "What were you talking about on the road?" Of course, he knows what they were talking about. So go ahead. Verses 35, verse 35 continues that. And he sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "If anyone desires to be first, he should be last of all and servant of all." The Spirit, McGarvey said, which proudly seeks to be first in place, thereby consents to make itself last in character. For it reverses the graces of, it should be the, take the R off of that, of the soul, turning love into envy, humility into pride, generosity into selfishness. You see, when you want to be on top, you get everything's turned upside down in terms of your attitude toward Christ. Instead of being humble, you're proud. See, those are the kinds of things McGarvey's laying out there. And that's what Jesus is pointing to, that this is a problem of character. Now go back to Matthew, where Jesus deals with this idea. I'm going to pick back up. We'll just read from the top, all the way from verse 1. And it came, at that time, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Then Jesus called a little child to him and set him in the midst of them and said, "Assuredly I say to you, unless you're converted and become," now watch this, "as little children." The focus is only on the child as a visual demonstration. The real point that he's making is you got to be like a child. Okay, in what sense? Well, let's keep going. He'll explain it. "You'll by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." Children are remarkable. Every now and then, I get to see this as a living demonstration. Somebody will be carrying a child coming in. Hey, they've come into the worship, and I'll go over and the child's got a sucker, we'll just say. And I'll say, "Ooh, a sucker." And is it good? And I get a nod while they keep that sucker in their mouth. And I'll say, "Could I have some?" And some of them will stick it right out for me. Of course, I don't ever take any, but children are pretty free, as a general rule, to share. They don't have to be number one. They don't have to be on top. They're perfectly happy with letting somebody else be in charge, particularly mom and dad. They don't have any problem with that. They don't fight over that. Jesus says, if you want to be really what you ought to be in the kingdom, therefore the church, you got to be like a child. You got to give up selfish tendencies and become childlike. Now, notice he says, you become like a little child. That was in the earlier part, right? Now watch verse 5, because I think now he focuses not on the child, but on the childlike person, the Christian who's childlike. Whoever sees one little child like this in my name receives me. He's not talking about children here. He's talking about people who become like children. And he says, if you receive that kind of a person, you're receiving me, is the message that he is delivering there. And go on verse 6, where he says, but whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea. And I've noted here that Jack Lewis in his commentary said the word here is scandalizo, and it's not important that you remember that word, but listen to what he says. Leading into sin. Now, if you're one of those people that likes to mark in your Bible, then you want to look at verse 7, because he says, woe to the world because of offenses. It's the same word. Translated a little bit differently, because, English teachers, they teach you all the time, don't use the same word over and over again. Use a synonym. So the translators here use a synonym in this case, okay? But it's the same word, and the idea here is you don't want to lead them into sin. You don't want to cause them sin. In fact, in the margin of my Bible, in verse 7, it says enticements to sin. Don't put a temptation in front of a babe in Christ. Don't do that. Because woe to you if you do. And there comes that idea that he goes on to say, woe to the world because of offenses. For offenses must come, but woe to that man by whom the offenses comes. If your hand or foot caused you to sin, cut it off, cast it from you. It's better for you to enter into life lame or maimed, rather than having 2 hands or 2 feet to be cast into everlasting fire. If your eye caused you to sin, pluck it out, cast it from you. It's better for you to enter into life with 1 eye, rather than having 2 eyes to be cast into hell fire. Hellfire. In that case, the word hell is the Greek word Gehenna. It's the valley of Hinnom. And if you'd look at 2 Chronicles chapter 28, you'll see that valley spoken of in that place. 2 Chronicles chapter 28, it's verse 3. He burned incense in the valley of the son of Hinnom, and burned his children in the fire according to the abominations of the nations whom the Lord had cast out before the children of Israel. You're going to see that kind of expression more than once in the Old Testament. I just want to give you an example. Why the valley of Hinnom? Why is that so vivid for the Jews? Well, they say, historically speaking, that valley is where they dumped the garbage of Jerusalem. And there was a fire constantly burning in that. Imagine, the easiest way for me to imagine it is, imagine a bunch of tires that catch fire. But they're in a spot where it's not going to hurt anything. Man, they'll smolder and burn for days. They'll just go on and on and on. Sometimes you go by where they're clearing a piece of land, and they've pushed up all these stumps and parts of trees, and they'll maybe pour a little kerosene on it, and they'll light it. That burns for days. If it doesn't rain, it's going to keep burning and burning. The Valley of Hinnom was constantly burning. And that's a pretty vivid image, if you would, of hell. And so he's warning them not to offend a little one, and that is a little one in Christ, because you'll end up there. So we've already dealt with the hyperbole, so I'll leave that alone. Next week we will pick up from after these stories. Okay.